Marcus Chen had worked the night shift at Riverside Manufacturing for 18 years when he disappeared. It was March 23, 1987, a cold Tuesday night when the fog rolled in thick from the Columbia River and settled over the factory like a gray blanket. The last person to see Marcus alive was his supervisor, Bill Crawford, who checked on him at 2:15 a.m. during the routine security rounds. Marcus was exactly where he was supposed to be, standing beside machine number 7 in the textile division, feeding cotton through the industrial looms that had been running continuously since 1949. He waved at Crawford through the safety glass, gave him a thumbs up to indicate everything was running smoothly, and went back to work. When Crawford returned at 4:30 a.m. for the next check, Marcus was gone. The machine was still running. The cotton was still feeding through the looms in perfect rhythm. Marcus's lunch pail sat unopened on the nearby table, his thermos of coffee still warm to the touch. His jacket hung on the hook beside his workstation, his car keys tucked safely in the right pocket where he always kept them. But Marcus Chen had vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all. Crawford's first instinct was that Marcus had stepped away to use the restroom or check on another machine. It happened sometimes, especially during the quiet hours after midnight when the factory felt more like a tomb than a workplace. The old building creaked and settled in the darkness, pipes clanged with random bursts of steam, and the constant hum of machinery created a hypnotic background that could lull even the most experienced workers into a kind of waking dream. But Marcus was different from the other night shift workers. He was precise, methodical, never left his station without telling someone where he was going. In 18 years, he had never missed a shift, never been late, never been caught sleeping on the job or drinking during work hours. He was the kind of employee supervisors loved and coworkers found slightly unsettling in his reliability. Crawford searched the immediate area around machine number 7, then expanded his search to include the entire textile division. The factory floor at night was a maze of shadows and mechanical noise, with dozens of places where someone could easily get lost or hurt. Massive looms rose like metal giants in the darkness, their rotating drums and flying shuttles creating a constant rhythm that had driven more than one worker to the edge of madness over the years. But there was no sign of Marcus anywhere. By 5 a.m., Crawford had enlisted the help of 2 other supervisors and begun a systematic search of the entire building. Riverside Manufacturing was enormous, a sprawling complex that had grown organically over the decades as new departments and production lines were added to meet changing market demands. There were sections of the factory that some workers had never seen, storage rooms filled with obsolete equipment, maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the main floor like the arteries of some vast organism. The search continued until the day shift arrived at 7 a.m., bringing with it questions that Crawford could not answer. Where was Marcus Chen? Why had he abandoned his post in the middle of the night? And most troubling of all, how had he managed to leave the building without being seen by anyone? The police investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately fruitless. Detective Sarah Walsh arrived at the factory at 9 a.m., accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a crime scene photographer. She was a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience, someone who had seen everything from domestic disputes to armed robberies to industrial accidents that would haunt her dreams for years afterward. But Marcus Chen's disappearance was unlike anything she had encountered before. Walsh began by interviewing every worker who had been on duty the previous night. The night shift at Riverside Manufacturing was a tight-knit group of men and women who had worked together for years, people who knew each other's habits and personalities almost as well as they knew their own families. If Marcus had been planning to disappear, if he had been having problems at home or at work, someone should have noticed. But everyone told the same story. Marcus had seemed completely normal on March 22nd. He had arrived for work at his usual time, exactly 11 p.m., carrying his lunch pail and thermos just like he had every night for the past 18 years. He had nodded hello to the security guard, checked in with Crawford, and gone to his station beside machine number 7. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, nothing to suggest that this would be his final night at Riverside Manufacturing. Walsh examined every inch of the factory floor, paying special attention to the area around Marcus's workstation. The concrete beneath machine number 7 was stained with decades of oil and cotton dust, but she found no bloodstains, No signs of struggle, no evidence that anything violent had occurred. The machine itself was in perfect working order, its safety systems all functioning properly, its emergency stops easily accessible and clearly marked. The detective interviewed Marcus's family next, driving to the small house on Maple Street where he had lived with his wife Linda and their 3 daughters for 16 years. Linda Chen was a quiet woman in her early 40s, someone who had spent most of her adult life supporting her husband's steady but unglamorous career at the textile factory. She answered Walsh's questions with the patience of someone who had already asked herself the same things 100 times. No, Marcus had not seemed worried or depressed recently. No, he had not mentioned any problems at work or conflicts with his coworkers. No, there had been no unusual phone calls or visitors to their home. No, he had not been drinking more than usual or showing signs of mental instability. He had simply been Marcus, reliable and predictable, the kind of man who mowed the lawn every Saturday and fell asleep in his recliner every Sunday afternoon while watching football. The only thing Linda could remember that seemed even slightly out of the ordinary was that Marcus had been staying up later than usual in recent months, often sitting at the kitchen table after dinner and writing in a notebook that he kept locked in a small metal box. When she asked him about it, he had explained that he was keeping track of things at work, documenting procedures and observations that might be useful for training new employees. But when Walsh asked to see the notebook, Linda discovered that the metal box was empty. The investigation expanded to include Marcus's coworkers, his friends from the neighborhood, the bartender at the tavern where he occasionally stopped for a beer after work. Everyone described the same man, quiet, dependable, perhaps a bit antisocial but certainly not someone who would simply vanish without explanation. He had no debts, no enemies, no secrets that anyone knew about. Detective Walsh reviewed the security footage from the single camera mounted above the factory's main entrance. The system was primitive by modern standards, a black and white monitor that recorded directly onto VHS tapes that were changed every 24 hours. The footage showed Marcus arriving for work at 10:58 p.m. on March 22, walking through the front doors with the same purposeful stride he had used every night for 18 years. But the camera never showed him leaving. Walsh had the tapes examined by experts, frame by frame, looking for any sign that Marcus had exited the building through the main entrance. The footage was grainy and sometimes difficult to interpret, with shadows and lighting that could obscure important details. But the experts were unanimous in their conclusion: Marcus Chen had not left Riverside Manufacturing through the front doors on the night he disappeared. The detective obtained blueprints of the factory from the city planning office and spent hours studying the building's layout. Riverside Manufacturing had been constructed in phases over several decades, with additions and modifications that created a complex floor plan full of dead ends and forgotten spaces. There were loading docks, emergency exits, service entrances, and maintenance access points scattered throughout the building, any one of which could have provided an escape route for someone who knew the building well enough. But all of these exits were secured with locks that required keys or access codes, and the security log showed that none of them had been opened during the night shift on March 22. Either Marcus had somehow obtained unauthorized access to these exits, or he had never left the building at all. The theory that Marcus had suffered some kind of accident and fallen into the machinery was quickly dismissed after a thorough examination of every piece of equipment on the factory floor. The looms were equipped with emergency shutoffs that would have triggered immediately if anything larger than a cotton boll had gone through them. The conveyor belts and sorting machines were all examined and found to be clean. The industrial waste bins contained nothing but textile scraps and cotton dust. But Detective Walsh was nothing if not thorough. She had the maintenance crew drain and inspect every tank, vessel, and container in the building that was large enough to hold a human body. She had cadaver dogs brought in to search for the scent of decomposing flesh. She even had portions of the concrete floor examined with ground-penetrating radar to determine if anything had been buried beneath the surface. Nothing. As the weeks passed and no trace of Marcus was found, Walsh began to consider more exotic possibilities. Had he been abducted by someone with access to the factory? Was there a secret entrance or exit that no one knew about? Had Marcus been involved in something illegal, something that might have motivated someone to make him disappear? She investigated Marcus's financial records, looking for evidence of gambling debts, drug transactions, or other activities that might have put him in danger. But his bank account showed only the regular deposits of his factory paychecks and the modest withdrawals needed to support a middle-class family. He owned no property beyond his house, drove a pickup truck that was 8 years old and fully paid for, and had no investments or savings accounts that suggested hidden wealth. Walsh interviewed his coworkers again, this time asking more pointed questions about workplace conflicts, union politics, and the possibility that Marcus had witnessed something that someone wanted to keep secret. But Riverside Manufacturing seemed to be exactly what it appeared to be, a struggling textile factory trying to compete with overseas manufacturers by keeping costs low and production high. There were no major scandals, no suspicious activities, no reasons why anyone would want to make Marcus Chen disappear. The detective even explored the possibility that Marcus's disappearance was connected to his military service. He had been drafted during the Vietnam War and served 2 years as a supply clerk at a base in Germany, far from any combat zones. But Walsh thought it was possible that he had been involved in some classified operation that had come back to haunt him 20 years later. But Marcus's military records showed nothing unusual. He had been an unremarkable soldier who followed orders, stayed out of trouble, and was honorably discharged in 1971 with no black marks on his record. If foreign agents or government conspirators were involved in his disappearance, they had left no trace of their activities. As spring turned to summer and summer turned to fall, the Marcus Chen case gradually faded from the headlines. Other crimes demanded Detective Walsh's attention, other families needed her help, and other mysteries required her skills. But she never forgot the quiet man who had simply vanished from a locked factory floor, and she never stopped wondering what had really happened during those 2 hours and 15 minutes between Crawford's security checks. The case officially went cold in December of 1987, filed away in the police department's archives along with hundreds of other unsolved mysteries. But Linda Chen never stopped hoping that her husband would somehow find his way home, and she never remarried, never moved from the house on Maple Street, never gave up the belief that Marcus was still alive somewhere, unable to contact his family for reasons she could not understand. Their 3 daughters grew up without their father, graduating from high school and college with an empty chair in the audience where Marcus should have been sitting. They learned to navigate the world without his quiet guidance, to make important decisions without his steady presence, to build their own families while carrying the weight of an unanswered question that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The years passed. 1990. 1995. 2000. The textile industry continued its long decline, unable to compete with cheap labor in developing countries. Riverside Manufacturing laid off workers, closed production lines, and struggled to find new sources of revenue. The night shift was eliminated in 1993, and the factory switched to day-only operations with a skeleton crew of aging employees who remembered the days when the building had hummed with activity around the clock. Detective Sarah Walsh retired in 1999, after a career that had spanned 3 decades and hundreds of cases. In her final interview with the local newspaper, she was asked about the investigations that had stayed with her over the years, the mysteries that she had never been able to solve. Marcus Chen was at the top of her list. He didn't just vanish, she told the reporter. People don't just disappear from locked buildings without leaving some kind of trace. There's an answer to what happened that night, and I think it's probably a simple one. We just never looked in the right place. But by then, there was no one left who cared enough to keep looking. Riverside Manufacturing closed permanently in 2003, another victim of overseas competition and changing markets. The building sat empty for 2 decades, slowly deteriorating as rain leaked through the roof and vandals broke the remaining windows. Homeless people occasionally took shelter in the abandoned structure, and urban explorers sometimes broke in to photograph the decaying machinery and graffiti-covered walls. But no one thought about Marcus Chen anymore. His disappearance had become just another piece of local folklore, a ghost story that older residents sometimes told to newcomers as an example of the strange things that had happened in their town over the years. The details of the case faded from memory, replaced by more recent tragedies and mysteries. By 2024, the structure was scheduled for demolition to make way for a mixed-use development of condominiums and retail space. The city had been trying to revitalize the old industrial district for years, hoping to attract young professionals and empty nesters who wanted to live in converted factories and warehouses with exposed brick walls and high ceilings. The demolition crew arrived on a wet Thursday morning in October, equipped with heavy machinery and explosives designed to bring down the old factory in a matter of hours. But before the building could be destroyed, city regulations required a final safety inspection to ensure that no hazardous materials or historical artifacts would be damaged in the process. Inspector Janet Rodriguez had performed hundreds of these pre-demolition surveys over the years. Most of them were routine affairs, checking for asbestos insulation and lead paint, documenting any architectural features that might be worth preserving for historical purposes. She expected the Riverside manufacturing building to be no different from any of the other industrial sites she had examined throughout her career. Rodriguez was a meticulous professional who took pride in her thoroughness. She carried a digital camera, a tablet computer loaded with building plans and regulatory checklists, and a collection of testing equipment that could identify everything from radon gas to PCB contamination. Her job was to ensure that the demolition would be conducted safely, without releasing toxic substances into the environment or destroying anything of cultural significance. She began her inspection on the main floor, working her way systematically through each department and production area. The factory floor was a maze of abandoned machinery and debris, with sections of collapsed ceiling and walls that had been damaged by years of neglect. Rodriguez documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, checking off items on her tablet as she completed each section of her survey. The textile division where Marcus Chen had worked was particularly deteriorated, with machines that had been stripped of valuable parts by scavengers over the years. Rodriguez could see where machine number 7 had once stood, now marked only by a concrete pad and some disconnected electrical cables. She made a note that this area would need special attention during demolition due to the presence of old lubricants and cleaning solvents that had soaked into the floor over decades of use. It was when Rodriguez descended to the basement level that she noticed something odd about the floor plan. According to the architectural drawings from 1926, there should have been a service elevator connecting the basement to the main floor and the upper storage areas. The original blueprints clearly showed an elevator shaft in the southeast corner of the building, with mechanical equipment and electrical connections that would have been typical for that era. But when Rodriguez looked for the elevator, she found only a blank wall covered with the same industrial green paint that had been applied throughout the building sometime in the late 1980s. The wall looked perfectly normal, with no obvious signs that it had ever been anything other than a solid partition between the basement storage area and the building's structural framework. Rodriguez consulted her tablet again, comparing the current layout with the original plans. The discrepancy was clear and unmistakable. Either the architectural drawings were wrong, which was highly unlikely given their level of detail, or someone had sealed off the elevator shaft at some point during the building's history. The inspector was curious by nature, someone who enjoyed solving puzzles and uncovering the hidden stories that old buildings could tell. She had discovered everything from Prohibition-era smuggling tunnels to Cold War-era bomb shelters during her career, and she had learned to pay attention when things didn't match the official records. She examined the wall more closely, running her hands along its surface and tapping it with her knuckles at regular intervals. Most of it felt solid, with the dull thud that indicated concrete or brick behind the paint. But in one section, about 4 feet from the floor and roughly the size of an elevator door, the sound was different. Hollow. Rodriguez retrieved a small electric drill from her equipment case and made a pilot hole in the wall, just large enough to insert a fiber optic camera. The device was one of her favorite tools, a flexible cable with a tiny lens at the tip that could snake through small openings and transmit images to a handheld monitor. She had used it to explore everything from deteriorating sewer lines to the inside walls of historical buildings. She inserted the camera through the hole and watched the monitor as the lens advanced into the darkness behind the wall. At first she saw nothing but empty space and some old wooden framework. But as she maneuvered the camera to look upward, the image on the monitor made her gasp aloud. Behind the wall was indeed an elevator shaft, just as the original blueprints had indicated. But the elevator car was still there, suspended halfway between the basement and the main floor by cables that had somehow held their load for decades. And lying on the floor of that elevator car, barely visible in the camera's dim light, was what appeared to be a human skeleton wearing the faded remains of a work uniform. Rodriguez sat back on her heels, staring at the monitor in shock. In 25 years of building inspection, she had never encountered anything like this. She had found plenty of dead animals, forgotten storage rooms, and obsolete mechanical equipment, but never human remains sealed away behind a false wall. She took several photographs of the monitor screen, documenting what she had discovered, then carefully withdrew the fiber optic camera and sealed the pilot hole with a piece of tape. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for her cell phone to call the police. The call was answered on the second ring by a dispatcher who sounded bored until Rodriguez explained what she had found. Within minutes, the routine demolition inspection had become a potential homicide scene, with police units and crime scene technicians racing toward the abandoned factory through the gray October afternoon. Detective Mike Santos arrived within an hour, followed by crime scene technicians, the county coroner, and a photographer who specialized in documenting unusual death scenes. Santos was Detective Walsh's successor, a veteran investigator who had grown up in Portland and remembered the Marcus Chen case as one of the most baffling mysteries in the city's recent history. Santos stood at the sealed elevator shaft opening and stared into the darkness, his flashlight beam picking out details that the fiber optic camera had missed. The elevator car was an old-fashioned freight lift, designed to carry heavy machinery and raw materials between floors. It had been manufactured sometime in the 1940s or 50s, with a simple manual control system and brass buttons that had turned green with age. But someone had modified the elevator extensively over the years, adding wiring and mechanical components that were not part of the original design. Additional buttons had been installed on the control panel, connected to cables that disappeared up into the shaft above. Small electric motors had been mounted on the car's frame, along with what appeared to be a homemade air circulation system. The skeleton on the elevator floor was fully clothed, though the fabric had deteriorated badly over the decades. Detective Santos could see the remains of what had once been blue work pants and a matching shirt, along with steel-toed boots that had held up better than the organic materials. A plastic ID badge, miraculously preserved in the dry air of the sealed shaft, identified the remains as Marcus Chen, employee number 4739, hired November 15, 1969. But Marcus was not alone in the elevator. Scattered around his remains were dozens of small objects that made no immediate sense to the investigators. Metal tools that looked handmade, crafted with the precision of someone who understood machinery and had access to a well-equipped workshop. Lengths of copper wire twisted into complex shapes that might have been components of some larger device. Small mechanical contraptions that served no obvious purpose, assembled with gears and springs and tiny electric motors salvaged from other equipment. It looked like the contents of an inventor's laboratory, or perhaps the obsessive collection of someone who had too much time on their hands and an unusual understanding of how things worked. The mystery deepened when crime scene technicians discovered that the elevator's control panel had been extensively modified. The original buttons for up, down, and stop were still there, but they had been joined by at least a dozen additional controls that had been wired into the shaft's electrical system. Some of the new buttons were labeled with cryptic abbreviations: OBS, REC, ALM, SEC. Detective Santos photographed everything before anything was moved or disturbed. The crime scene photographer took hundreds of images from every possible angle, documenting not just the skeleton and its surroundings, but every detail of the modified elevator car and its mysterious collection of devices. When the initial photography was complete, Santos requested that the entire elevator shaft be examined before the skeleton was removed. He had a feeling that Marcus Chen's remains were only part of a much larger story, and he wanted to understand the complete picture before any evidence was lost or contaminated. Using industrial climbing equipment borrowed from a local construction company, crime scene technicians rappelled down from the floor above to investigate the upper reaches of the elevator shaft. What they found there challenged every assumption they had made about Marcus Chen and his final days at Riverside Manufacturing. The elevator shaft extended all the way to the roof of the building, 3 stories above the basement where Rodriguez had made her initial discovery. But instead of ending in a standard motor room with pulleys and counterweights, the shaft opened into a hidden space that had been carved out of the building's structure decades earlier. The room was roughly 20 feet square, with a low ceiling and walls that had been lined with metal shelving from floor to ceiling. And those shelves were filled with the most extraordinary collection of objects anyone had ever seen in connection with a missing persons case. There were hundreds of small mechanical devices, each one carefully crafted and labeled with handwritten tags that bore dates ranging from 1975 to 1987. Clockwork mechanisms that served no apparent purpose, elaborate systems of gears and springs that had been assembled with the precision of a master watchmaker. Electric motors connected to switches and timers that could have been used to operate remote equipment. There were notebooks filled with technical drawings and mathematical calculations, all written in the same careful handwriting that appeared on the device labels. Some of the diagrams showed detailed plans for mechanical contraptions, while others contained what looked like architectural drawings of the factory floor, with notations and measurements that suggested someone had been planning modifications to the building's structure. But it was the photographs that truly shocked the investigators. Mounted on the walls of the hidden room were dozens of black and white photographs showing the interior of Riverside Manufacturing during different periods of its operation. Some of the images were clearly old, dating back to the 1930s or 40s based on the clothing and hairstyles of the workers they showed. Others were more recent, taken during the 1970s and 80s. But all of them showed the same thing: workers going about their daily tasks, unaware that someone was watching them from above and documenting their every move with systematic precision. The photographs had been taken through a system of hidden cameras and periscopes that Marcus Chen had somehow installed throughout the factory over the course of many years. Detective Santos found evidence of at least 12 different observation points, connected by a network of cables and mirrors that allowed someone in the hidden room to monitor virtually every corner of the building. The technical sophistication of the surveillance system was remarkable, especially considering that it had been built using technology available in the 1970s and 80s. Marcus had created a network of mechanical and electrical devices that would not have been out of place in a professional security installation, all constructed in secret during his night shifts at the factory. Detective Santos found Marcus's journal on a small desk in the corner of the room. The leather-bound notebook contained entries dating back to 1975, written in the same meticulous handwriting that appeared on all the device labels and technical drawings. The early entries were relatively normal, describing Marcus's work routine, his interactions with other employees, and his observations about the factory's operations. But as Santos read further into the journal, he began to understand that Marcus Chen had not been the simple, reliable worker that everyone remembered. The man who had spent 18 years feeding cotton through textile looms had also been conducting an elaborate surveillance operation that had consumed increasingly more of his time and mental energy. The journal entries from 1976 described Marcus's growing suspicion that his coworkers were watching him and talking about him behind his back. He wrote about conversations that stopped when he entered a room, about looks that his fellow workers exchanged when they thought he wasn't paying attention, about a general sense that he was being excluded from some kind of group conspiracy. By 1977, Marcus had begun taking photographs of his coworkers, initially using a simple camera that he smuggled into the factory in his lunch pail. He documented who talked to whom, who took breaks together, who seemed to be the leaders of what he increasingly saw as an organized effort to undermine his position at the company. The journal entries from 1978 marked a turning point in Marcus's mental state. He had convinced himself that the conspiracy against him extended beyond his immediate coworkers to include supervisors, management, and possibly even people outside the factory. He began to see patterns in everything, interpreting coincidences as evidence of coordination, reading sinister meanings into innocent conversations. It was also in 1978 that Marcus began construction of his hidden observation room, using his mechanical skills and his access to the building's infrastructure to create a secret space where he could monitor the entire factory without being detected. The journal described in meticulous detail how he had accessed the old elevator shaft, how he had carved out the room above it, and how he had installed the surveillance equipment that would allow him to document the conspiracy he was certain existed. The entries from 1979 through 1983 documented the expansion of Marcus's surveillance system and his growing paranoia about the people around him. He had installed cameras in the locker room, the break area, the supervisor's offices, and even the parking lot, creating a comprehensive record of factory life that he analyzed for signs of the plot against him. But as Detective Santos continued reading, he realized that Marcus's journal contained more than just paranoid fantasies. Mixed in with the conspiracy theories and surveillance reports were detailed observations about safety violations, worker misconduct, and management practices that suggested Marcus had indeed been witnessing real problems at Riverside Manufacturing. He had documented supervisors who drank on the job, safety inspectors who accepted bribes to overlook dangerous conditions, and union representatives who made deals with management at the expense of the workers they were supposed to represent. Some of his photographs showed workers sleeping during their shifts, others showed equipment that had been deliberately sabotaged to slow production during labor disputes. The journal suggested that Marcus had initially planned to use his evidence to expose corruption and improve conditions at the factory. But as his mental state deteriorated, he had become convinced that revealing what he knew would only make him a target of the very people he was trying to expose. The entries from 1984 and 1985 painted a picture of a man spiraling into complete paranoia and isolation. Marcus had begun spending entire weekends in his hidden room, monitoring the factory even when it was closed, convinced that his enemies were using the empty building for secret meetings and planning sessions. He had also become convinced that his family was part of the conspiracy against him. The journal contained increasingly suspicious observations about his wife Linda's behavior, her conversations with neighbors, and her interactions with their daughters. Marcus believed that his home was being watched, his phone calls monitored, and his mail intercepted by people who were working with his enemies at the factory. By 1986, Marcus was spending more time in his hidden room than he was at home. He had stockpiled food, water, and basic supplies in the space above the elevator shaft, creating a survival bunker where he could retreat if the conspiracy against him finally came out into the open. The journal described elaborate plans for defending the room from attack, including booby traps and alarm systems that would alert him to any attempt to discover his hiding place. The entries from early 1987 showed a man who was completely disconnected from reality. Marcus had convinced himself that his co-workers were planning to kill him, that management was involved in some kind of criminal enterprise that his surveillance had uncovered, and that government agents were working with local police to cover up the truth about what was happening at Riverside Manufacturing. The final entries in the journal were dated March 20th through March 22nd, 1987, just days before Marcus disappeared. They described his growing certainty that his enemies had finally discovered his surveillance system and were preparing to move against him. Crawford has been asking too many questions about the elevator, Marcus had written on March 21st. He knows something. I can see it in his eyes when he looks at me. They're planning something for tomorrow night. I can feel it. The final entry was dated March 22nd, just hours before Marcus vanished. This is it. They're coming for me tonight. I can hear them talking in the break room, making their plans. But I'm ready for them. I've activated the final protocol. The room is sealed, the evidence is safe, and the machine will protect everything until someone worthy discovers the truth. If they want to find me, they will have to look very carefully. I'll be waiting for them in the place they'll never think to search. Detective Santos read the entry 3 times before its implications sank in. Marcus had not vanished accidentally or been abducted by his imaginary enemies. He had planned his own disappearance as part of some elaborate defensive strategy that existed only in his paranoid imagination. But something had gone wrong with Marcus's plan. Instead of hiding temporarily in his secret room until the perceived threat passed, he had somehow trapped himself in the elevator shaft and died there, alone and forgotten, while his family and the police searched frantically for any trace of what had happened to him. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Marcus's secret activities over the years. The hidden cameras had been powered by electricity stolen from the factory's main lines, routed through a complex system of wires and switches that Marcus had installed during his night shifts when no one else was around to notice what he was doing. The observation room had been supplied with enough food, water, and basic necessities to sustain one person for several weeks. Marcus had been preparing for a siege that would never come, building defenses against enemies who existed only in his diseased imagination. But the most disturbing discovery was the purpose of all those mysterious mechanical devices that had been found scattered around Marcus's remains in the elevator car. He had been building them as components of an elaborate security system designed to protect his secret room from discovery and intrusion. Motion detectors connected to alarm systems. Remote-controlled locks that could seal off access points. Even small explosive devices that could have seriously injured or killed anyone who tried to enter the room without knowing the proper procedures for disarming them. In his paranoid delusion, Marcus had turned himself into the guardian of secrets that existed only in his own mind. He had spent years preparing for a confrontation that would never come, protecting information that no one else cared about, building defenses against enemies who were nothing more than figments of his deteriorating mental state. The coroner's examination revealed that Marcus had died from dehydration and starvation sometime in late March or early April of 1987. The elevator car had become his tomb, a metal box suspended above the basement floor where he had spent his final days writing increasingly incoherent entries in his journal as his physical condition deteriorated and his grip on reality finally slipped away completely. The autopsy showed no signs of violence or injury beyond what could be attributed to his prolonged confinement in the elevator. Marcus had not been murdered by his imaginary enemies or killed in some industrial accident. He had simply died alone in the darkness, surrounded by the mechanical contraptions he had built to protect secrets that no one would ever care about. The last legible words in Marcus's journal were written in a shaking hand just days before he died: "The truth is safe now. No one will ever find it. The machine will keep working long after I'm gone, and someday someone will understand what I was trying to protect." But there was no truth to protect, no conspiracy to expose, no enemies to defeat. Marcus Chen had spent the final years of his life fighting a war that existed only in his mind, and he had died as a casualty of his own paranoid delusions. Detective Santos closed the case file on a gray afternoon in November, 37 years and 8 months after Marcus Chen had last punched his time card at Riverside Manufacturing. The hidden room and its contents were photographed, catalogued, and eventually donated to the Portland Historical Society as a unique example of workplace paranoia and the devastating effects of untreated mental illness. The surveillance photographs that Marcus had taken over the years provided a fascinating glimpse into industrial life during the 1970s and 80s, but they revealed no conspiracies or cover-ups, only the mundane reality of people working ordinary jobs and living ordinary lives. The corruption and misconduct that Marcus had documented were real enough, but they were the kind of petty violations that occurred in workplaces everywhere, not the elaborate criminal enterprise that his diseased mind had imagined. The elevator shaft was filled with concrete before the building was demolished, finally sealing away the mechanical tomb where Marcus had spent his final weeks. The secret that he had died trying to protect was buried along with the rest of his elaborate fantasy, reduced to rubble and steel that was hauled away to a landfill on the outskirts of the city. Linda Chen, now 79 years old and living in a retirement community outside Portland, wept when Detective Santos told her what had really happened to her husband. She had remarried in 1992 after years of waiting and hoping, had raised her daughters as a single mother, and had built a new life from the ruins of her first one. But she had never stopped wondering what had become of the quiet man who had kissed her goodbye on that cold March evening and never came home. "I knew something was wrong with him those last few months," she told Santos through her tears. "He was so suspicious of everyone, so convinced that people were talking about him behind his back. But I never imagined it was that bad. I never thought he was living in a whole other world that the rest of us couldn't see." She remembered the notebook that Marcus had kept locked in the metal box, the one that had disappeared before Detective Walsh could examine it. Now she understood that it had probably contained early drafts of the paranoid observations that had eventually filled the journal found in his secret room. "If I had pushed harder, if I had made him see a doctor or talk to someone about what he was thinking, maybe this wouldn't have happened," Linda said. But he seemed so sure of himself, so convinced that he was the only one who could see what was really going on. How do you argue with someone who thinks everyone else is blind or lying? The demolition of Riverside Manufacturing was completed on a Tuesday morning in December. The old factory that had employed hundreds of people over the decades was reduced to rubble in less than 4 hours, its secrets finally buried along with the man who had guarded them so obsessively for so long. Construction of the new Riverview Commons development began the following spring, with luxury condominiums and trendy retail spaces that attracted young professionals and empty nesters looking for urban convenience with. The demolition of Riverside Manufacturing was completed on a Tuesday morning in December. The old factory that had employed hundreds of people over the decades was reduced to rubble in less than 4 hours, its secrets finally buried along with the man who had guarded them so obsessively for so long. The new development that rose on the site was named Riverview Commons, a collection of upscale condominiums and trendy shops that attracted young professionals and empty nesters looking for urban convenience with a touch of industrial chic. The developers incorporated some of the factory's original brickwork into the new construction, a nod to the building's historical significance. But none of the new residents knew about Marcus Chen or the secret room where he had spent his final weeks. That story was known only to the investigators and historians who had studied the case, a footnote in the larger history of a city that had grown and changed beyond recognition since 1987. Marcus Chen had vanished into his own paranoid delusions, trapped himself in an elevator shaft, and died protecting secrets that existed only in his mind. His story became a tragedy of mental illness and workplace isolation, a reminder that the most dangerous prisons are sometimes the ones we build for ourselves inside our own heads. The case file was finally closed, 37 years after a reliable factory worker had simply vanished from his post beside machine number 7, leaving behind only questions that no one had known how to answer until a building inspector noticed that a wall sounded hollow.